Michael Sandel has been one of America's preeminent political philosophers for more than 2 decades. He has spent a career probing the limits of liberalism and democracy. He's also pressed the hundreds of thousands who have watched his lectures and talks broadcast from Harvard University to engage with the tough questions that face citizens of modern democracies. Michael Sandel is Harvard's professor of government theory, and we're delighted to welcome him to our studio tonight. It's nice to see you again.
Good to be with you, Steve.
Thanks for making the trip. And I guess, well, we may as well say this right off the top. You were brought here by the Institute for Canadian Citizenship.
Yes.
This is the organization that was started by our former Governor General, Adrienne Clarkson, and
Yes.
her husband, John Ralston Saul. You're participating in the 6 Degrees Citizen Space, so we thank them for getting you here, and equally as much to our studio here. Okay, with that homework out of the way, 2 decades ago, you wrote a book called Democracy's Discontent, and you wrote that without a stronger civic spirit, liberalism would collapse, giving way to those who would shore up borders, banish ambiguity, harden the distinction between insiders and outsiders, and promise a politics to take back our culture and take back our country. I'm going to infer from that you're the only guy in America who wasn't shocked when Trump won last year.
I was not shocked.
Yeah.
I was dismayed, but not shocked. And here we are.
Yeah.
Here we are. But I think it's been a few decades in the making.
You predicted it, though, last year. When you put that out there, I wonder what kind of feedback you got from sort of progressive, smart, maybe a tad sanctimonious people who thought, you don't know what you're talking about.
Well, you've already guessed.
Yeah.
2 decades ago, when I wrote the book that you just generously quoted from, I got a lot of resistance from my liberal and progressive friends who thought I was worrying unnecessarily, that liberalism was more or less intact, and that the embrace by liberalism of the global economy and even of market mechanisms would be a way to avoid controversy in politics, a way of avoiding the contentiousness that arises when we engage in morally robust questions in public life. I thought that was a mistake. I thought that was hollowing out public discourse, creating a kind of vacuum that was dangerous. And so we see.
Somebody filled a vacuum.
Yes. And not only in the US, but with the rise of right-wing kind of ultra-nationalist populism in many European countries, I think we see this vacuum being filled. People sense that after 3 to 4 decades of a kind of faith that markets would decide tough public questions for us, democratic citizens are impatient with too empty a public discourse. They want politics to be about big things and also about values, about moral questions, about justice and inequality and what it means to be a citizen. And when liberal and progressive voices failed to offer that kind of politics, when they became largely technocratic in their approach, that vacuum was filled by narrow, intolerant voices and the kind of strident nationalism we see today.
Hillary Clinton, quite famously during the last campaign in your country, called those who sort of supported that part of the political conversation the basket of deplorables. Now, we know in hindsight that was a very ill-advised thing to say.
Right.
Was she right about it, though?
I think she was wrong about that. Now, there is a portion of Trump supporters who are deplorable, who partake of the kind of racist sentiments we saw on display in Charlottesville.
Alt-right stuff.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So that's to be sure. But I think it's important to distinguish, especially important for liberals and progressives to distinguish, between Trump himself and the people who support him. Because many of the people who supported Trump were working class and middle class people who were angry at liberal elites and who had presided over 2 to 3 decades of a kind of neoliberal global capitalism that rewarded those at the very top, but left most ordinary people feeling disempowered. We need to listen to the legitimate grievances, I think, of ordinary working people, men and women who feel excluded, who feel left out, who feel rightly that the version of global capitalism we've had has left them behind. And that, I think that many liberals and progressives have been tone deaf.
No, I get that, but the notion that Donald Trump would somehow become the champion for that group of people.
Right.
I mean, did you see that coming?
Well, not that he himself would, but it's understandable in retrospect. He is a master of the politics of resentment. He understands humiliation as a political sentiment. And so he was able, he was able to tap into that resentment, to that anger with elites very successfully, in the way that the proponents of Brexit did in Britain, in the way that Marine Le Pen in France has done there, in the way that the far-right Nationalist Party in Germany succeeded in getting 13% of the vote. So I think the politics of resentment speaks to some legitimate grievances that the mainstream parties had better figure out how to address if we're going to try to stem this kind of strident nationalist populist uprising.
I don't want to push this too far, but the guy who represents that political way of thinking today is clearly Donald Trump. The guy who represented it 25 years ago, I think, was a guy named William Jefferson Clinton. There's a bit of a through line between those two, isn't there?
Well,
I'm not pushing it too far, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, in some ways, yes, because Bill Clinton came from the South. He understood working class grievances, and he was quite adept at appealing to them while at the same time embracing Wall Street donors. He opened up the Democratic Party to substantial support from Wall Street and from the financial industry, and his policies once in office turned out to be very Wall Street friendly, and this was one of the charges against Hillary Clinton, a charge pressed not only by Trump, but before him by Bernie Sanders.
And he could talk to African Americans too in a way that Trump clearly did not.
Bill Clinton could, yes. So it was a more generous politics, of course, and it was pre-populist in a way. There was not the nationalism. In fact, there was the embrace of not only the financialization of the economy, but also of global trade, both of which have been sources of the anger and grievances that Trump in his way and Bernie Sanders in his articulated during the last campaign.
Let me get your take on something that the British writer George Monbiot recently said, which was that the problem with politics today is that there is, quote, no new story. You know, throughout history, he says, we've had stories like the New Deal in FDR's time, the Reagan Revolution.
Right.
They've driven politics, but he says today liberalism has become kind of storyless and boring. Do you share that view?
Yes. Yes. I think that narrative and story is important in politics because political argument and political rhetoric at their best enable us to make sense of ourselves, of where we are in a given moment, of how democracy is faring and how we fit. And liberals have not succeeded. Liberals have turned largely in their public discourse to be managerial and technocratic, to eschew moral argument in politics for fear of disagreement or controversy. And the result is a kind of storyless politics that lacks resonance, that lacks the capacity to inspire. And I think that's the great challenge for liberalism today.
You couldn't say that about Barack Obama, though. That wasn't storyless and that wasn't boring at all.
Yes and no.
Yes and no? How so?
During the 2008 campaign, he had a powerful sense of story and of narrative. And he projected and articulated a civic idealism that inspired the country and many people around the world. And he promised a rejuvenated kind of public discourse that did not shy away from moral and even spiritual argument in politics. This was his 2008 campaign. But he was not able to translate that civic energy and idealism into governing. And he fell back. This was partly because he took office at the time of the financial crisis. He brought in with him economic advisors who had presided with Bill Clinton over the deregulation of the financial industry, who had declined to regulate derivatives, who had set the stage for the financial crisis they were now being brought in to address. And so the bailout that he endorsed, which bailed out the banks while not really holding them to account, didn't do much for ordinary homeowners. That created a deep anger and resentment that cast a shadow, I think, over the rest of his presidency. and deprived him of the moral voice that was his great promise in 2008.
Thus, yes and no.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Let us now then go through 4 themes which you have advanced that you think liberals need to better understand if they're going to, be players in this
Right.
new era of Trump, I guess we're going to call it.
Right.
What do liberals need to know about income inequality? Let's start there.
Well, they first of all need to address in a more serious way than they have the growing inequality, the gap between rich and poor. Liberals cast their lot with the kind of global capitalism we had over the last 3 to 4 decades, but they ignored the growing inequality that it created. Now, one response is to say, well, let's have job training and improved access to education to help those left behind, and that's all to the good. But that's not enough, because people worry not just about wages and jobs, but also that the new financialized, globalized economy doesn't really respect the kind of work that ordinary men and women do, that working people do. And Democrats in the US, liberals generally, have not been very effective at speaking to the corrosive civic consequences of inequality in a way that would resonate.
Do you want to go back to the Eisenhower confiscatory 91% income tax rates?
Well, I don't think we need to do that.
Okay.
But I do think that we need to pay more attention to inequality, not only for its effect on the spending power of people whose incomes stagnate, but also we have to focus, and I think liberals should focus, on the way in which inequality is corrosive of a sense of commonality and common purpose. It creates almost a segregated society where the affluent and people of modest means increasingly live separate lives. They send their children to different schools. They live and work and play in different places. And it's very hard to have a sense of shared citizenship when the inequality destroys the public places and common spaces of democratic citizenship.
Let me, since you and I are both huge baseball fans,
Yes.
get you to use the baseball metaphor that speaks to
Right.
us quite well.
Well, this is my idea of the skyboxification of civic life. When I was a kid, I grew up in Minnesota, and I was a Minnesota Twins fan. And we'd go to the ballpark. And there were always box seats, which were more expensive, and seats in the bleachers. But do you know what the difference in price was back in the mid-'60s? Maybe this was before your time.
Go ahead, tell me.
It was $1 for the bleachers and $4 for the best seat behind home plate.
How about that?
The effect was, going to a baseball game was a kind of class mixing experience. CEOs sat side by side with mailroom clerks. Everyone had to eat the same soggy hot dogs and drink the same stale beer. And when it rained, everyone got wet. But this changed beginning in the 90s and 2000s when more and more sports stadia created these luxury skyboxes, VIP, corporate skyboxes, which separated those who were the privileged who could watch from air-conditioned comfort high above the common folk in the stands below. And this is what I call it's the skyboxification of sport. No longer the case that everyone eats the same food, waits in the same long lines for the restroom. It's no longer even true that when it rains, everyone gets wet. Now, it wouldn't matter so much if it only happened in baseball stadia. But this skyboxification has been unfolding throughout our social and civic life, and that's what worries me.
Theme 2, meritocratic hubris. What's
Yes.
that?
It's a tendency of those on top to inhale too deeply of their own success, to believe that if I landed on top or if I'm very financially successful, it's my own doing, by golly. It's a reflection of my merit, my virtue. And by implication, those less advantaged than me, maybe they don't work so hard. Maybe they aren't so talented. And when this idea seeps in, then those on the bottom resent those on the top, and we see this in the backlash against elites with populism. Yep. Also, the disadvantaged begin to absorb some of that message, and they begin to wonder, they begin to ask not only, well, is this system rigged? That's about justice and fairness, but am I somehow inadequate? And there's something galling and demoralizing about that sentiment that further fuels the anger and the resentment, very much of the kind that we've seen with the populist backlash, the resentment against elites.
Let's, before we play, before we talk about theme number 3, we want to play a little clip here. The historian, Yuval Noah Harari. Don't know if you know him?
Yes.
Do? Okay.
Yeah.
Here's what he had to say when we talked about some of this a year ago. Sheldon, roll the clip, please.
Within 20 or 30 years, we may see the rise of a new massive class, the useless class. Just as the Industrial Revolution created the urban working class, so the new revolution will create the useless class. People who are not just unemployed, but unemployable, and the social and political implication of that could be catastrophic. You could have billions of people without economic importance and without political power.
Those are the seeds of a revolution.
Or the seeds of a very frightening dystopia.
Do you share his fear about a so-called useless class?
Yes, meritocratic hubris gestures toward the worry that this is already upon us, that in not so many words, that those on top increasingly view less advantaged fellow citizens as more or less useless or as less valuable. And that's deeply destructive to the solidarity and the sense of common purpose, the sense of community that democracy requires. So it's damaging, not only for those on the bottom who feel they're looked down upon, it's damaging for all of us insofar as we all have a stake in the health of a democratic civic life.
Would a guaranteed annual income go some distance to addressing that?
It very much depends on whether it were presented as an alternative to the messy welfare state, which is what some would have, or whether it's a way of buying off people who are rendered quote unquote useless by robotics and artificial intelligence, as some in Silicon Valley anticipate. My worry about the universal basic income, which some have proposed, is that it would simply be a way of buying off those who are seen no longer to have an important role to play through work in a democratic society and political economy. If it were truly a generous stipend that expressed a shared sense that we are all in this together and that different people contribute in different ways, that would be different. But I doubt it would be sufficiently generous to convey that sense of common spirit and purpose and inclusion. My worry is that it would be a way of signifying the supposed uselessness of those rendered obsolete by modern technology and robots. And that, I think, is a great worry.
Indeed. Let's do one more on this, and that is patriotism and national community. Your country is going through one hell of a debate right now about what it means to be a patriot.
Yes.
You know, some people taking the knee during the national anthem at football games and that kind of thing.
Right.
What do liberals need to know about patriotism and community?
The most important thing liberals need to know about it is that patriotism and a sense of national community are not right-wing causes that should be kept at a distance. As a source of embarrassment, many liberals often speak as if they were allergic to patriotism. I think this is a great mistake because it's given right-wing, xenophobic, nationalist political parties and politicians a kind of monopoly on patriotism and national community. And I think that's a terrible mistake. I think what liberals should do is to articulate a version, a progressive version of patriotism and national pride and sense of community, and to show its connection to the mutual obligations of citizens embodied in the welfare state, in mutual provision, in healthcare systems, in public transportation, in public schools, the public spaces and institutions and practices that liberals and progressives should be advancing and defending. But I don't think that we can successfully do that by ignoring patriotism by ignoring the language of national pride and national community.
Let's just make sure we understand that, because your president at the moment says that if you take the knee during the national anthem,
Right.
you are disloyal and not patriotic at all, and he actually used language stronger than that.
Yes.
But we'll just leave it there.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
That he's wrong.
Can you be a patriot and take the knee during the anthem?
Absolutely. In fact, patriotism sometimes requires protest and dissent. And when some of the NFL players are taking a knee during the national anthem, they're not expressing hatred for their country or indifference. They are expressing a care and concern for the injustice that their country is perpetrating in communities, especially toward racial minorities. That is an act of patriotism. That is an act of caring about the fate of the national community and wanting to improve it, to make it more just, not less.
That is a harder patriotism to describe and defend than hand on the heart, salute, my country right or wrong, right?
Well, I'm not so sure,
No?
Steve. If you look back at the speeches, the most resonant speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., who was arguing for civil rights, who was leading demonstrations, engaging in civil disobedience sometimes, and getting arrested. There were, of course, those who said that's unpatriotic, that's anti-American. But if you listen to his political rhetoric, it was deeply American. He was recalling America to its highest ideals, to the principles of equality embodied in the Declaration of Independence, as was Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, for heaven's sakes. So I think that some of the most powerful movements of political protest and dissent, including King's, have been appealing to the highest principles of one's country. And that's patriotism, a far deeper patriotism than the kind Donald Trump invokes when he condemns those NFL players for taking a knee.
Fascinating. Here's, you probably know Mark Lilliff from Columbia University. Here he is writing in the New York Times about the end of identity liberalism. He says, the fixation on diversity has produced a generation of liberals and progressives narcissistically unaware of conditions outside their self-defined groups and indifferent to the task of reaching out to Americans in every walk of life. At a very young age, our children are being encouraged to talk about their individual identities even before they have them. By the time they reach college, many assume that diversity discourse exhausts political discourse and have shockingly little to say about such perennial questions as class, war, the economy, and the common good. Identity politics, he writes, is largely expressive, not persuasive, which is why it never wins elections, but can lose them. He's got it in for identity politics, which of course has been a calling card of the Democratic Party for decades now.
Yeah.
What's your view?
Well, I think he overstates it. I think that expressive politics and persuasive politics can and should go together. I think it's a mistake for the Democratic Party to define itself in too thoroughgoing a way in terms of identity politics or even the diversity agenda. But I think that racial justice and gender equality are very important moral and political causes. And there's no reason why a civil rights agenda can't be made compatible with an agenda that speaks about national community and solidarity and public deliberation. And I think that's the challenge that the Democratic Party in the US faces and that progressive and social democratic parties in democracies around the world need to think through.
Let's go back 20 years again and finish up with a quote from your book, Democracy's Discontent. You wrote, "The hope of our times rests with those who can summon the conviction and restraint to make sense of our condition and repair the civic life on which democracy depends." Okay, who's going to do that?
Well, all of that's our task as democratic citizens. I don't think we can rely on national political parties or politicians to do that for us. They are so given over to a kind of narrow managerial technocratic discourse, which seems to avoid controversy. I don't think we can sit back and wait for inspirational leadership from on high. So I think what has to happen in civil society, in educational institutions, in NGOs, in the media, and in civic gathering places and public spaces where citizens gather in smaller groups to reason together, to argue together about the common good, perhaps in a small sphere initially, but in ways that will equip them to be effective citizens and to project those debates about the common good beyond the small settings in which they sometimes find their first and richest occasion.
Don't they need a leader? Don't they need Bobby Kennedy riding in on a white horse over the hill somewhere?
Well, Bobby Kennedy was a great hero of mine, and he understood the importance of connecting liberal public purpose to moral and spiritual argument. And since then, since his tragic death, the Democratic Party has lacked such a figure, except, we thought for a moment, with Barack Obama. Yeah. So we do need that kind of leadership, but we can't wait for it, and we can't expect that it will arise on its own. We need to create the seedbeds for a morally more robust public discourse than the kind to which we become accustomed, and that begins in civil society.
I appreciate that, but as you look out at the political environment in your country right now, do you see anybody who remotely looks like RFK, the second coming of?
Not at the moment, but one never knows. The figures who best embody these hopes and aspirations often come on the scene suddenly and seemingly unbidden. We didn't know much about Barack Obama until a year or two before he ran. So it remains to be seen. But I think to connect progressive public purpose to moral and spiritual argument, that's the challenge for political leadership, whether at the national level or among everyday citizens within the common spaces and public places we find in which to gather.
We're always so delighted when you can find time for us here because you give us a hell of a lot to think about, and we like that on this program. That's Michael Sandel from Harvard University, professor of government theory there. Thanks so much for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.